At the end of the pandemic, some of us tellers were lucky enough to be invited to the wonderful Timpanogos Storytelling Festival in Utah. It had been over 2 years since we had performed in front of live audiences. And at the welcome dinner, I was standing next to Donald Davis. He leaned towards me and he whispered, "Do you think we'll remember how to do this?" This from a man with over 20 books, 50 recordings, thousands, and I mean thousands of performances, Circle of Excellence, Lifetime Achievement Awards, and he's wondering if he's forgotten how to tell stories. And then it hit me. The storytellers who never stop worrying, is this going to be good enough? They are the best. Donald could rest on his laurels, but he refuses to do so. And so all of us, he cares about his craft, he cares about us as his audience, so no matter how many times we hear him, each time we do, we know we are hearing the next best version of an extraordinary artist. Please show your appreciation for Donald Davis.
Well, thank you. Thanks for being here. Many of you know that I was ordained a United Methodist pastor actually 58 years ago. And I served in local churches until I retired to go back to the storytelling of my childhood full time. And in 1972, I was appointed to the United Methodist Church in Andrews, North Carolina. Well, I'd gone from a city where everybody had street addresses. But when I got up there in the mountains, people either got their mail at the post office or their address was Route 1. It was before UPS, before 911, and I couldn't figure out where people lived. I would hear that somebody was sick, and I'd ask how to get there, and they'd say, "Will you go up there to where the Swans used to live?" Swans have been dead 20 years. And you turn till you get up to where they cut that big tree down. Well, I had a wonderful church member, Mr. John Christie. Mr. Christie was 78 years old. He had been the church treasurer for 50 years. He had also been the president of the power company, the president of the school board, the master of the lodge. He had done everything in town. Mr. Christie knew everybody, and everybody trusted him. So one day when he came in doing some of the treasurer's work, I said, "Mr. Christie, I'm having a hard time finding where people lived. I wonder if you could make a list of the people I should go visit first." He said, "You know, the ones that aren't going to be here longer." I said, "Yeah, those, that'll do right there. And take me around to find out where they live." He said, "I'll be back tomorrow." He came back the next morning. He had a paper. It had 27 names on it. He said, "There's nobody on this list under 80. Every afternoon, let's go out, and I'll take you to where 2 people live till we found all of them." And the next afternoon, we took off in the afternoon. We went up to see the Bristols. Mr. Bristol was a retired farmer. Miss Bristol was a retired Latin teacher. Then we went over to see the Ropers, and then we came back to town. And as we came into town, we passed a little short, unpaved road. And as we passed that little road, he said, "Up there's where Miss Morton lives." Zoom. The next day we went out again. We visited 2 households. And as we came back into town, we passed that little road. And again he said, "Up there's where Miss Morton lives." Zoom. We kept doing that until there was only one name left on the list, Miss Morton. And I thought, if Mr. Christie's not going to take me up there, I'm on my own. Well, by now I'd figured there was something unusual about Miss Morton up that little road, because I'd be in town and somebody would come up to me, and without even using her name, they would say, "Have you met her yet?" And I thought, okay, I'm going to go get it over with. So right after lunch that day, I headed up, and when I turned in that little road, I had to slam on the brakes because there was a fence now built across the road. Not a gate, but a fence. There was a little cow gap in the fence, and on the other side, what used to be the road was totally grown up. There were tree saplings as big around as your leg and a little trail going up through there, not a road. I thought it's been a long time since anybody's been brave enough to come up here. And I started up that road, and I came to this little clearing. And it had been a clearing, but it had mostly grown up. And at the other side of it, there was a little frame house, never painted since it was built. The tin roof, very, very rusty. The roof that came out over the porch in the front, but the sleepers under the porch had rotted away. And the porch still fastened to the house had flopped down to the ground. And it pulled the roof down with it. So there was no way the front door would open. But the path went up to a little door at the end of the house, and I went up that path to the end of the house. The door was right beside the chimney. At one time, the chimney and the house had gotten along, but they'd had a serious falling out. And now as the chimney came up the side of the house, it leaned farther and farther away till you couldn't figure out how it was still standing up. Well, I walked up to that little end door, and before I even knocked on the door, it opened. And there she stood, Miss Catherine Serene Morton. I'm going to start at the bottom. She had on these men's heavy Brogan work shoes, no laces, with the tongues flopped down under the toe. She had on before it was popular, a pair of men's overalls. One of the Galluses had given up. The other was still working. She had on an army surplus shirt that still had sergeant stripes on the arms and a name over the pocket that said Brookbank. I never did find out who Brookbank was. And then I came to her face. Growing up in Haywood County, they used to tell us if you could flatten Haywood County out, it would cover Texas. And when I looked at the wrinkles on her face, I thought if you could flatten her out, you could put 3 women back in there. She had these rimless glasses with little gold earpieces, and then her hair. Her hair looked like it could have been swept up on the floor of the Brillo plant on Friday afternoon, and then it got wet and rusted. She looked down at me and she said, "You must be that new little preacher boy, because I know everybody else and I don't know you. Come on in the living room." And I went inside and immediately saw that I was indeed in the living room where she lived. There was a little wood stove in the corner with a couple of cane-bottom chairs there. And then there was a green plastic sleeper sofa. Not the kind that you pull a mattress up out of the bottom of, but the old kind where you just go click, click, and it flops down. Obviously, that's where she slept, because on that sofa there was an old mummy-type army surplus sleeping bag, 2 flat pillows, and on the floor all of her accoutrements of the night, like a perpetually unwashed water glass, a jar of Vicks Vapor Rub with a lost lid so you smelled it all the time, a big jar of Vaseline so old it was petrified, some wandering Kleenex, and a little wood pile of high-mileage Q-tips. There was a Bible bound in blue leather with an Eastern Star emblem on the front. She said, Let's go in the kitchen and we can have lunch together while we get acquainted. She said, be careful because I keep my rock collection in the kitchen. We started in this little kitchen door. There was one little clear path that went over to the refrigerator and the sink. The rest of the entire floor was covered with little rows of neatly organized rocks. The kitchen table was covered with little rows of rocks. The counters were covered with little rows of rocks. The doors had been taken off the cabinets. They were full of little rows of rocks, and the kitchen sink was full of rocks that hadn't been organized yet. I said, I see your rock collection. She says, I'm still working on it. And we went over to that refrigerator, and she opened it up, and there were only two things inside. Reese's peanut butter cups and little green glass bottle Coca-Colas. She got a Reese's peanut butter cup, whipped out a knife, cut it in two. She kept half and gave me half. And then, much to my relief, we each got our own Coca-Cola. And we went back down and we sat down on the edge of that little sleeper sofa and we got acquainted. I found out that she was a retired high school English teacher. She had taught high school English 40 years. And she said she taught in every high school in the westernmost 7 counties in North Carolina. And I went back after that visit and got the map, and I counted up how many high schools were in those 7 counties, and I realized that in 40 years, she had been very frequently highly recommended. She had this peculiar belief that if you weren't working, you shouldn't take money. So when her retirement check would come every month, she would mark on the front of it, no longer teaching, and send it back to Raleigh. And nobody could convince her that it was already her money that had been taken out. No. She wasn't working. She wasn't going to take it. Which kind of created a community dilemma, because in order for her to keep living, people had to come up with little jobs she could do so they could pay her little bits of cash money, which she would now accept, so she could buy Reese's peanut butter cup and Coca-Colas. Well, we visited for a little while, and I said, I better go now, but I'll come back to see you pretty soon. She said, don't go yet. You haven't seen my cats. I said, no, I saw them outside when I was coming up here. She said, oh, no, you only saw the yellow ones. I let them out by color because they get along better that way. Come down the hall, you can see the rest of them. And beside that kitchen, we started down this little hallway. There were 3 doors, obviously one-time bedroom doors, but they had been sawed off at the top, right above the top hinge. And she pulled up a chair. She says, step up and look in there. That's where I keep the black ones and the white ones, or the black and white ones, or the black or white ones, or anything that has to do with black or white. And I stepped up in that chair and looked down, and sure enough, there were about 15 cats in that room. Then the next room we didn't stop at because it was the yellow cat room, and I already seen them outside. And then the third one, she said, it's the miscellany. And I looked over in that room. There were cat colors I'd never even imagined before. They were gray and almost pink and blue, every kind of 3-color cats, all kinds of cats. I said, how many do you have, Miss Morton? She said, this morning or right now? She said, I believe I woke up with 31, but I think I've added 2 more today. And then I learned that little stub of road was the dropping off place for all the unwanted cats in Cherokee County. Well, I gradually would go to visit that old lady, and pretty soon I just began to love to go see her. She just had the best stories. We had the greatest adventures. We'd play with the cats. And down in town, every time I got kind of up to here with normal, I'd go back up there and see her and discover that the world was an interesting place after all. Well, a new family moved to town, Jerry and Nancy Bunyan. Jerry Bunyan was a retired zoo vet. He had spent his whole career at the Cincinnati Zoo. But when he retired, he didn't want anything else to do with veterinary medicine. He wanted to read and garden. And so nobody knew what he had been earlier in his life. Till one day, he had gone over to a neighbor's house to borrow a rototiller because he was going to plant a whole big asparagus patch. And when he got over there, the man's wife said, "He's down in the barn, there's a cow down." And Jerry said he went down into the barn where the neighbor was, and here was this cow, and he knew right off what was wrong with it. It was trying to birth a dead calf. And he said, what was I going to do? Watch the man's cow die or come out? And he decided to come out. He said they got a Swiss Army knife, sterilized it with a cigarette lighter, and he did what he had to do, went inside the cow, dissected the dead calf, and brought it all out in pieces. The next day he was back in practice. But he didn't mind. He didn't have an office. He had a Dodge truck. He equipped that truck with all his veterinary stuff, and all he did was make house calls and farm calls. He says, give me a big Hereford bull any day instead of a water buffalo. He loved it. One day he came by the church and he said, I keep hearing about that lady with all those cats. And I hear you're the person to take me up there to meet her. I said, you did you? Let's go on up there right now. And we went up and knocked on the door, and she opened the door, and I said, Miss Morton, this is Dr. Bunyan. She said, I'm not sick. I said, no, he's a cat doctor. Oh, she laughed her head off. He said, Miss Morton, I've come up here to see if you would let me give rabies shots to your cats. She said, I didn't ask you, and if you do, I won't pay for it. He said, you don't need to pay. It's a community service. And she finally agreed to let him give 31 unpaid shots to those cats. She had handed him a cat. He had to find out what its name was. And he had pet the cat. And he had rolled it over and scratched it on the belly. And pretty soon that cat was purring away. He'd kiss the cat on the head and rock it back and forth. And then he'd give it that rabies shot. The cat never ever knew what happened. And as Miss Morton watched him love on her cats like that, she fell in love with him. When it was over, he picked up this old cat that was living in a box under the stove. Its name was Captain. Captain had almost no hair and had lumps all over him. He said, Miss Morton, the captain here is miserable. He has cancer. He has tumors everywhere. He's a sweet cat, but would you want me to help him go on to cat heaven? And after she had watched him give the shots, she decided she would. And she held there and cried, the old captain, while Dr. Bunyan put her cat to sleep. Well, every once in a while, we'd go back up there, we'd touch up on the cats because she was always getting more and getting more and getting more. Pretty soon, he started slipping in distemper also. It was the most well-vaccinated bunch of cats anywhere west of Asheville. I went up there one day and she had a rag tied around her head. That's the only way you could describe it. It looked like, Marley's ghost in an old black and white Christmas Carol movie. And one side of her jaw was all puffed out. I said, what in the world's the matter? She said, I've got an abscessed tooth and it's breaking through on the outside. I said, Miss Morton, you need to go to the dentist. She says, I've been and I am not going back. Why? She says, I went to that dentist. He looked at my mouth and he said, Miss Morton, this is awfully bad. I'm afraid I'm going to have to put you to sleep. I jumped out of that chair and ran all the way home after that. And I had to hunt all over western North Carolina to find a dentist who would pull her tooth without doing it surgically. I finally found a man over in Bryson City, and he agreed to do it. He set aside a whole afternoon, and he wiggled, and he wiggled, and he worried, and he wiggled. He told me later he was scared to death he was going to break her jaw. But he finally wiggled that tooth out of there, and between getting rid of the tooth and a good course of antibiotics, I almost said she's back to normal. One day, Dr. Blossom and I went up there, to touch up the cats. And before we left, she said, Dr. Blossom, I'm getting so many cats, I'm being overwhelmed. They drop them off, and then the ones I've got keep causing more. Is there a way to put a stop to that? He said, yes, there is. What we can do is we can put the tomcats in neutral. Let me go get what I need. And he went down to his truck and he came back with one big tall rubber boot and a scalpel. And he sat down on the chopping block, put that boot between his knees, and he said, bring me the first one. He knew all their names by now. She brought him a big old tomcat. He started petting that tomcat till it was purring away, scratching its belly, rocking it back and forth. And then all of a sudden, with that scalpel in one hand, with the other hand, he ran it down into the boot, clamped down with his knees, pulled back its tail, shoop, it was gone. She said, they don't teach it like this in veterinary school. But if you do it that long way, you're liable to lose 1 out of 100 from anesthesia. I never lost one like that. He doesn't even know what happened. See, he's over there eating again right now. We threw 14 cats out of gear that day. And she was totally, totally happy. I loved going up there. It was so much fun. I would just spend afternoons with her. I would spend days with her. She had a little job. Her main job was mowing cemetery plots at the non-perpetual care cemetery. She would mow all your family's plots for the summer for 50 cents per dead relative. And if you had a plot you hadn't used yet and you were paying for the others, she'd mow yours free. One day she told me, she said, Preacher, I've got an idea about how you can make some big money. I go over there and I mow people's cemetery plots, and they pay me for mowing, but they also give me $1 for gas money. And some days I may mow for 6 or 8 families, and that means $6 or $8 for gas money. I've been calling that taxi man down there in town, but I think what I'll do from now on is call you. And you can pick me up and we can get some gasoline from a mower. You bring a book to read because you probably like to read, and you can sit on a tombstone and read while I mow all those plots, and I'll give you the gas money. Big money, big money. Did you ever hear your mouth say something your head hadn't thought about yet? All of a sudden, I just heard my mouth talking, and it said, oh, Miss Morton, that's a nice idea, but that taxi man has 5 children, and we only have 1, and I think he needs the money more than I do. Phew, I escaped. Well, I was there for 6 years, and I just would go visit her off and on all the time. I was there through her gradual decline, but she wouldn't give up her cats. Every year at Christmas time, we would have this tree in the church. It would be a fir tree with no decorations on it. It was called the white gift tree. And people would wrap gifts in just plain white paper. They would say things on there like 8-year-old boy or young female adult, just descriptions like that. And they'd all pile up under the tree. And then there was a whole big container of clothespins so you could pin currency on the tree. Oh, the kids loved to beg their parents for $1. Maybe they get $5. And the tree would be just covered with currency and piled up with presents. And after we had the Christmas Eve service, all those presents would go to Joe Wheeler from social services. And he would take them to places where Santa Claus lost his map. And then all the currency would come off, and we'd have a little committee that would meet and choose several families that needed a little boost at Christmas, and then people would take those gifts to them on Christmas morning. The first year I was there, we met, and there was a volunteer to take the Ropers' money to them. There was a volunteer to take the Tatum sisters' money to them. There was a volunteer to take the other Christies' money to them. And then Miss Morton. And without any discussion, the whole committee in unison said, "Preacher will do it." And I did it. That night we had the only true, honest, white Christmas snowfall I remember in my life. And the next morning it was totally silent from the snow as I went up to her house and got all the way up there and knocked on the door before she heard me coming. She says, "Come in, preacher. What are you doing up here?" I said, "I brought you something." "What'd you bring me?" "A little present from the church." "What is it?" "I think it's money." "How much?" I said, "Count it." And she opened a little envelope and she counted out 27 $1 bills. She thought for a minute. Then she pulled out $4, folded that, and put it in the pocket of her overalls, put the rest of the money back in the envelope, handed it to me and said, "Take this back down to the church and use it for the needy." Well, the day after that, we were having the last budget approval meeting of the year, approving everything, including the pastor's salary. And up until that moment, I'd thought of all kinds of reasons I ought to get more money, till she pulled that little trick. And I could not ask for a penny more. Well, I wasn't there when she died, but nobody had seen her for about a week, and so they sent Peyton Ivy from the funeral home up there. Peyton went up, opened the door, and sure enough, she had died in her sleep there on that sofa. But on the floor, there was a cigar box that said Dr. Bunyan on the top. And inside that cigar box, 34 $1 bills. And a letter asking Dr. Bunyan, if she died, if he would use that money to put her 34 present cats to sleep so they could be buried with her because nobody else would take care of them. Jerry read that letter and he said, "You can forget about that. I got too much money in those cats." And 34 cats went home with him. And his wife Nancy said for about the next 6 weeks, every little cat that came within cat throwing distance got a well-vaccinated cat to take home with them. Well, we moved away from there, but once in a while I still think about her. Because there were things I learned from that dear old lady I could never have learned any other way. I learned that in no circumstance of life will I ever be so poor that I cannot still call myself wealthy. I learned how important it is to have people like Miss Morton living on the fringes of our communities. Because people like her allowed the rest of us to believe that we're normal. And I learned that if you want to live forever, be weird. Because to this day, I could still go back to Andrews, North Carolina, and walk down the street and hear people talking about dear old Miss Morton. Thank you.